I lost my sister who was loved more than me. There was no emotion on my face and not a drop of regret. When I was young, perhaps no older than 3 or 4, my mother would sit me down and explain, with a serious expression that was far too stern for a child's comprehension, just how important I was to the family. Not in the way that makes you feel special or loved, but in the way that makes you feel obligated. Eliza, my older sister by 2 years, was everything to my parents, fragile, precious, and the center of their universe. My role, as they so delicately put it, was to support her, to ensure that she could thrive, or survive, more like. Eliza was born with a rare, debilitating condition. It was never fully explained to me back then, though the fear in my parents' eyes and the endless doctor's visits made it clear that something was very wrong. As I grew older, I learned the words: renal failure, liver dysfunction, immune deficiency. Big words for a small girl to grasp, but I had to, because my parents made sure I knew what was at stake. They never said it outright, but the undertone was there, unspoken and undeniable. Eliza's life mattered more. I wasn't born out of love or the desire to add another member to the family. I was conceived as a contingency plan, a living insurance policy. They needed a backup for Eliza, someone who could be there when her body inevitably failed her. If she needed an organ, I was the donor. If she needed blood, I was the type match. If she needed care, I was the caretaker. From the moment I was born, my identity was tied to hers, and my life was not mine to live, but hers to use. As a child, you don't know any better. When your parents tell you something, you believe it, especially when they tell you that being a good sister means sacrificing your happiness for another's. I remember the first time I saw Eliza's meds laid out on the kitchen counter, colorful pills and vials lined up in neat rows. My mother handed me a cup of water and a tiny white pill saying, "Take this to Eliza, honey, she needs it." I did as I was told, and when Eliza smiled at me weakly from her bed, I felt a strange warmth, a misplaced pride. I was helping, I was doing my job, but that warmth didn't last. As I grew older, the responsibilities piled on, and the pride was replaced by something heavier, something darker. By the time I was 5, I was cleaning her peg tube, a task that should never have been given to a child. I remember the first time I saw the tube, an alien object snaking out of her abdomen, connected to a feeding pump. I stared at it, horrified and fascinated, until my mother's sharp voice brought me back to reality. "Don't just stand there, Lucy. Clean it properly. If you don't, it'll get infected, and then what will we do?" Her tone was accusatory, as if the weight of Eliza's survival rested solely on my tiny shoulders. I didn't understand why my mother couldn't do it herself, why this task was being handed to me, but I didn't dare question her. Not then. Eliza, for her part, seemed to enjoy the attention, and not just from our parents. She reveled in the power she had over me, the power of being the favored child, the one everyone had to cater to. If she wanted something, she got it. If she didn't want to play the game I suggested, we didn't play it. If she wanted one of my toys, it was hers. My parents would watch this dynamic with approving eyes, never stepping in, never telling her to share or to consider what I might want. It was as if they had decided that because of her illness, Eliza deserved to be spoiled, to have her every whim indulged. And so, my childhood was shaped by this dynamic. Eliza was the sun, and I was a planet caught in her orbit, unable to break free. I tried, at first, to be the best sister I could be. I really did. I took my role seriously because I believed that this was what made me valuable. I thought that if I could just be good enough, if I could just take care of Eliza well enough, maybe my parents would love me too, in a way that wasn't tied to her. But as the years went by, that hope faded. Eliza's demands grew more unreasonable, and my parents' expectations more suffocating. They never outright said it, but I could feel it in the way they looked at me, in the way they spoke to me. My sole purpose was to serve Eliza, to make her life easier, to bear the burden of her care so they didn't have to. My own needs, my own desires were irrelevant. I remember one summer when I was about 10. I had developed a love for music, especially the violin. My school was offering lessons, and I was so excited to learn, to have something that was mine, something that had nothing to do with Eliza. But when I brought it up to my parents, their reaction was swift and cruel. "Violin lessons? Really, Lucy? Do you have any idea how expensive that is? And what about Eliza? She doesn't need the extra noise upsetting her. You can't be selfish like this. Selfish. That word was a constant refrain in our household. Anything that deviated from what Eliza wanted or needed was selfish. If I wanted to take a walk in the woods to clear my head, I was abandoning her. If I wanted to wear clothes that didn't match her color preferences, I was being inconsiderate. Every aspect of my life was scrutinized and judged through the lens of how it affected Eliza. And yet, I couldn't hate her. Not entirely. There were moments, fleeting, rare moments, when she would let her guard down, when she would look at me not as her servant, but as her sister. I remember one night when she was particularly sick, her body racked with pain, tears streaming down her face. I sat by her bed, holding her hand, trying to comfort her. She looked at me with those big, scared eyes and whispered, "I'm sorry, Lucy. I'm sorry you have to do this." For a moment, my heart softened. I squeezed her hand and whispered back, "It's okay, Eliza. It's okay." But the next day, she was back to her old self, demanding, manipulative, and completely unaware of the toll she was taking on me. The older I got, the more I realized how deeply my parents had failed us both. They had failed Eliza by turning her into a spoiled, entitled child who couldn't see beyond her own needs, and they had failed me by stripping me of my identity, by reducing me to nothing more than a caregiver. The resentment grew, festering inside me like a wound that wouldn't heal. But I never let it show. I couldn't. My parents were too wrapped up in Eliza's world to notice me, and I had long since given up on the idea that they ever would. Instead, I learned to smile through the pain, to play the role they had cast me in, even as it slowly destroyed me. And then came the day that changed everything, the day Eliza died. The day Eliza died was not a day of tragedy for me. It was a day of complex, conflicting emotions. My parents, on the other hand, were inconsolable. The world they had meticulously constructed around Eliza, their angel, their perfect child, had crumbled to pieces. But I, standing in the corner of that sterile hospice room, felt something I hadn't anticipated, a strange sense of freedom. I was 15 when Eliza's health took a final turn for the worse. The doctors had been clear. There was nothing more they could do. The experimental treatments, the medications, the endless rounds of surgeries, they had all failed. My parents, ever the optimists when it came to Eliza, clung to hope until the bitter end, but even they had to face reality. Eliza was dying, and there was no stopping it. I remember the hospice workers, nurses, doctors, even volunteers, coming in and out of the room like clockwork. They were kind, but their kindness felt mechanical, practiced. Eliza was just another patient to them, another life slipping through their fingers. To my parents, however, she was everything. They stayed by her side constantly, whispering reassurances that she would be okay, that they were there for her, that she was going to a better place. I stayed in the background, as I always had, a silent observer. No one asked me how I was doing, not really. My role as Eliza's caretaker had ended, and now I was as invisible to them as the air we breathed. But there was one person who noticed me, Janice, one of the hospice nurses. She was a large, warm woman with a soothing presence that contrasted sharply with the clinical coldness of the hospice. She saw through my practiced smiles, my dutiful facade. One afternoon, while my parents were talking with the doctors, she approached me, her face full of genuine concern. "How are you holding up, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice gentle. I forced a smile. "I'm okay, really." Janice's eyes softened. She had seen this before, children who had been forced to grow up too fast, who had borne the weight of responsibilities that should never have been theirs. "You know, it's okay to grieve too. You don't have to be strong all the time." I didn't respond. How could I explain that I didn't feel grief, not in the way she expected? That the sadness I felt was not for Eliza's death, but for the years of my life that had been consumed by her. That a part of me felt guilty for not feeling more. Janice patted my arm gently. "If you ever need to talk, I'm here." I nodded, grateful for her kindness, but unable to take her up on the offer. Talking wouldn't change anything. Eliza's death wouldn't erase the years I had spent in her shadow. Dr. Carr, Eliza's primary physician, entered the room not long after Janice left. He was a tall, stern man with a face that had seen far too many deaths. He glanced at me, his eyes lingering for a moment longer than usual. He nodded, a simple acknowledgement of my existence, and then turned his attention to my parents. They spoke in hushed tones, discussing the inevitable. Eliza passed away that evening. The hospice room was quiet, save for the sound of my mother's soft sobs and my father's murmured reassurances. I stood at the foot of the bed, watching as her chest rose and fell one last time. There were no dramatic final words, no tearful goodbyes. She simply slipped away, leaving behind a fragile, broken body that had never allowed her to truly live. My parents were inconsolable. My mother wept as if her heart had been ripped from her chest, while my father tried to hold it together, though his own grief was palpable. They clung to each other, a pair of broken people who had lost their purpose in life. And there I was, standing apart, feeling strange. Strange because I wasn't overwhelmed with sorrow. Strange because I didn't feel the crushing grief that my parents felt. Strange because the only thing I could think about was what my life would be like now that Eliza was gone. As my parents grieved, I stood there, numb, detached, watching the scene unfold as if I were an outsider looking in. I should have felt something more, I told myself. I should have been devastated. But I wasn't. And that realization filled me with a sense of guilt that I couldn't shake. After Eliza's body was taken away, the arrangements for her cremation were made swiftly. My parents were insistent on holding a grand ceremony, a final tribute to their beloved daughter. They poured all their energy into planning the event, as if it were the last thing they could do for her. I helped where I could, but they barely noticed me. They were consumed by their grief, and I was an afterthought, as I had always been. The day of the cremation arrived, and the atmosphere was heavy with sorrow. My mother was weeping inconsolably, her tears soaking into the black fabric of her dress. My father was at her side, patting her back, whispering words of comfort that did little to soothe her pain. They were so wrapped up in their grief that they didn't even notice me standing a few feet away, watching them with a mixture of pity and resentment. A kind woman from the hospice approached me, her face filled with concern. It was Janice. "How are you doing, sweetheart?" she asked softly. I forced another smile. "I'm okay." She studied me for a moment, her eyes searching mine for any sign of the grief she expected to see. "You know, it's okay to grieve. You don't have to be strong for them all the time." I nodded, but her words felt hollow. I didn't need to be strong for them. They were already drowning in their own sorrow, oblivious to everything else. No, I needed to be strong for myself. I needed to find a way to move forward, to reclaim the life that had been stolen from me. As the ceremony began, I took my place among the mourners, listening as the officiant spoke about Eliza's life, her struggles, and the love she had been surrounded by. My parents had worked tirelessly to make sure everyone knew just how special Eliza had been, how much she had endured, how much she had been loved. They wanted the world to see her as they had seen her, a perfect, innocent soul who had been dealt a cruel hand by fate. But as I listened to the eulogies, the speeches filled with praise and admiration for Eliza, I felt a growing sense of disconnect. These people didn't know Eliza like I did. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know what it had been like to live in her shadow, to sacrifice everything for her, only to be ignored and forgotten. My father took the podium next, his voice thick with emotion as he thanked everyone who had helped care for Eliza in her final days. He rattled off a long list of names: the doctors, the nurses, the hospice staff, the charity workers who had provided support. He thanked them all, his voice breaking with each word, but he never mentioned me. I stood there, feeling the sting of his omission, a familiar ache in my chest. After everything I had done, after all the years I had spent caring for Eliza, he didn't even think to acknowledge me. I was invisible to him, as I had always been. The officiant turned to my mother, offering her the chance to speak. She rose from her seat, her body trembling with grief, and made her way to the podium. Her speech was brief, filled with sorrow and longing. She spoke of how hard it would be to live without Eliza, how much she would miss her, how she was now an angel watching over them. She spoke of her loss, her pain, her heartache, but she didn't speak of me. And then, the officiant looked at me. My parents' faces were blank, as if they had forgotten I existed. Their confusion was almost palpable, as if they couldn't understand why I was being asked to speak at all. After all, what could I possibly have to say? But this was my chance. This was my moment to finally speak my truth, to say the things I had kept buried inside for so long. I walked to the podium, my legs trembling, my heart pounding in my chest. I hadn't planned on speaking, but as I stood there looking out at the sea of faces, I knew I couldn't stay silent. "My name is Lucy," I began, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. I was Eliza's live-in carer for the last 12 years. A hush fell over the crowd. I could feel their eyes on me, their curiosity piqued by the unexpected turn of events. "I started caring for Eliza when I was 3, I continued. My first chore was picking up her toys and bringing her meds. By the time I was 5, I was cleaning her peg tube. I saw my mother nodding along, as if this was nothing unusual, as if it was only natural for a child to take on such responsibilities. But I could also see the expressions of those around her starting to shift, confusion and concern flickering across their faces. I was proud to look after my sister," I said, forcing the words out. "I wanted to be a good sister, to do my duty." My mother nodded again, her eyes glazed over with grief, still not comprehending the weight of what I was saying. "And I have my own thanks to give," I said, my voice growing stronger. "First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Carr for telling me I didn't have to donate my kidney, and that I wasn't a bad person if I didn't want to." There was a murmur of consternation in the crowd. My mother's face twisted in confusion, her eyes narrowing as she tried to make sense of my words. "I'd also like to thank my school counselor for teaching me the term parentification." The room grew tense, the atmosphere thick with discomfort. My father opened his mouth to speak, but I pressed on, determined to say what needed to be said. "And lastly," I said, my voice firm, "I'd like to thank myself for the years of hard work, dedication, and devotion, unrecognized and unappreciated, for being strong enough to endure erasure and indifference, with a smile, and for cleaning up a lot of shit." A shocked silence fell over the room. My parents stared at me, their faces pale, their expressions unreadable. I turned to the casket, the final resting place of the sister I had spent my life caring for. "Goodbye, Eliza. You were a spoiled, nasty bitch, but you never had a chance to be anything else. Our parents failed us both." And with that, I stepped down from the podium, my heart pounding, my mind racing. I walked through the crowd, feeling their eyes on me, their whispers following me as I left the room. For the first time in my life, I felt free. The days following Eliza's cremation were surreal. The fallout from my speech was immediate and intense. My parents were in shock, not only from losing their favored child, but also from the harsh truths I had laid bare in front of everyone they knew. Their perfect image of our family had been shattered, and they were left with the jagged pieces of a reality they had long ignored. I avoided them as much as I could in those first few days. It wasn't hard. They were so consumed by their grief and anger that they barely noticed my absence. When we did cross paths, they didn't know how to talk to me, and I didn't feel inclined to help them figure it out. A few days after the cremation, I received a call from Dr. Carr. I was surprised. He had always been professional, distant even during Eliza's treatment. I couldn't imagine what he would want from me now. "Lucy," he began, his voice measured and calm. "I wanted to check in on you. I know the last few weeks have been difficult, and I wanted to see how you're holding up." The kindness in his voice caught me off guard. I had been so used to everyone focusing solely on Eliza that it was strange to have someone express concern for me. "I'm managing," I replied cautiously. "I was also hoping we could meet," he continued. "There are some things I think we should discuss about your future, and perhaps some support that might be beneficial for you." Support. The word felt foreign, almost suspicious. No one had ever offered me support before, not really. I had been the one offering it, not the one receiving it. But something in Dr. Carr's tone made me agree. We met in a small cafe near the hospice, a neutral ground where I could avoid the suffocating memories of my home. Dr. Carr arrived punctually, his presence as calm and steady as ever. He ordered a coffee and I followed suit, unsure of what else to do. "I won't beat around the bush," he said once we were seated. "You've been through a lot, Lucy, more than most people your age should have to deal with. I've seen what this kind of responsibility can do to a person, especially when they're as young as you are." I stared at him, unsure of what to say. I wasn't used to people acknowledging my struggles. It felt unsettling. He continued, "I want to make sure you have the resources and support you need moving forward. Your parents are grieving, and I understand that, but that doesn't mean you should be overlooked. You deserve to have your needs recognized, too." I felt a lump form in my throat. It was strange hearing someone talk about my needs, my future, as if I were an individual with my own life and not just an extension of Eliza. "What kind of support?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "Therapy, for one," he said gently. "You've been carrying a lot of emotional weight, and it's important that you have someone to talk to, someone who can help you process everything you've been through." Therapy, it wasn't something I had ever considered. In my family, emotions were either ignored or suppressed, never openly discussed. But the idea of having someone to talk to, someone who could help me make sense of my feelings, was oddly comforting. I think I'd like that," I admitted, the words feeling strange on my tongue. Dr. Carr nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I'm glad to hear it. I can recommend someone for you, someone who specializes in cases like yours, cases like mine." The phrase hung in the air, a reminder of just how abnormal my life had been. "There's also the matter of your education," he added. "I know your schooling was disrupted because of your responsibilities at home. I want to help you get back on track, to make sure you have the opportunities you deserve." Education. Another thing that had been overshadowed by Eliza's needs. I had always been a good student, but my attendance had been erratic, and my grades had suffered as a result. The thought of going back to school, of focusing on my own future, felt both exhilarating and terrifying. I don't know what I want to do," I confessed, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on me. "I've never really thought about it." "And that's okay," Dr. Carr said reassuringly. "You don't have to have all the answers right now. What's important is that you have the chance to explore your options, to figure out what you want for yourself." I nodded slowly, the reality of the situation beginning to sink in. For the first time in my life, I had the freedom to make choices for myself, to pursue my own interests, to live my own life. It was overwhelming, but it was also empowering. As our meeting came to an end, Dr. Carr handed me a card with the contact information for a therapist and a tutor. "Take your time, Lucy," he said kindly. "You've been through a lot, but you're stronger than you know. Don't be afraid to lean on others for support. You don't have to do this alone." I thanked him, feeling a mix of gratitude and relief. For the first time in years, I felt like someone was truly looking out for me, like I wasn't just an afterthought. As I walked home, I found myself thinking about what I wanted for my future. It was a question I had never been allowed to ask myself before. What did I want? What were my dreams, my passions? It was daunting to realize that I didn't have answers to those questions, but it was also exciting to know that I now had the chance to find them. The next few weeks were a blur of new experiences and emotions. I started therapy, and though it was difficult at first, it became a safe space for me to unpack the years of pain, resentment, and confusion that I had bottled up inside. My therapist, a kind and patient woman, helped me navigate the complex web of emotions that had formed around my relationship with Eliza and my parents. It was a slow process, but each session brought me closer to understanding myself and what I wanted from life. I also began working with the tutor Dr. Carr had recommended. She was a young woman, not much older than me, with a passion for education and a knack for making even the most difficult subjects understandable. With her help, I started catching up on the schoolwork I had missed, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of accomplishment that wasn't tied to Eliza's well-being. My relationship with my parents remained strained. They were still deeply entrenched in their grief, unable to move past the loss of their perfect child. They didn't understand why I had said what I did at the cremation, why I had aired our family's dirty laundry in front of everyone. But I didn't regret it. For the first time, I had spoken my truth, and it was liberating. As I continued to work on myself, I began to distance myself from my parents. It wasn't a conscious decision, but rather a natural consequence of our divergent paths. I needed space to heal, to grow. and they were still trapped in the past, unable to see beyond their own pain. We still lived under the same roof, but emotionally, we were miles apart. One day, as I was leaving for a therapy session, my mother stopped me at the door. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. "Lucy," she began hesitantly, "why did you say those things at the cremation? Why did you have to hurt us like that?" I stared at her, unsure of how to respond. Part of me wanted to lash out, to tell her that she had hurt me far more than I had ever hurt her. But another part of me, a part that had grown stronger through therapy, recognized that she was speaking from a place of deep pain and confusion. "I didn't say those things to hurt you," I replied, my voice calm but firm. "I said them because they were true. I spent my entire life caring for Eliza, and in doing so, I lost myself. I needed to say those things for my own sake, to finally speak up after being silent for so long." My mother's eyes filled with tears. "But she was your sister, Lucy. We all had to make sacrifices for her." "And I understand that," I said gently. "But I was a child too. I deserved to have my own life, my own interests, my own identity. But I never got that chance because I was always expected to be there for Eliza. And I did it because I loved her. But I also need to love myself now." She looked down, her shoulders slumping as the weight of my words sank in. "I don't know how to do this without her," she whispered. "You need to figure out how," I said softly. "Because I can't be Eliza anymore. I can't be the person you need me to be. I have to be myself." With that, I left the house, leaving my mother standing in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. As I walked to my therapist's office, I felt a sense of resolve wash over me. It wasn't easy confronting my parents, but it was necessary. I couldn't move forward if I continued to let them dictate my life. I had to take control of my own destiny, even if it meant leaving them behind. Over time, I began to rebuild my life. I discovered new interests, new passions, and new friends who saw me for who I truly was, not just as Eliza's sister. I enrolled in school full-time, focusing on subjects that sparked my curiosity and brought me joy. I started volunteering at a local shelter, finding fulfillment in helping others on my own terms, not out of obligation, but out of genuine compassion. And slowly the wounds of my past began to heal. My relationship with my parents remained distant, but I found peace in that distance. I no longer needed their approval or their validation. I had found my own worth, my own identity, and that was enough. Years later, as I stood at my college graduation, surrounded by friends and mentors who had supported me on my journey, I looked out into the audience and saw my parents sitting near the back. They looked older, wearier, but there was something different in their eyes, something softer, more reflective. After the ceremony, they approached me, my mother hesitating before pulling me into a tentative hug. "We're proud of you, Lucy," she said quietly. It wasn't an apology, and it didn't erase the past, but it was a start. As I hugged her back, I realized that forgiveness wasn't about absolving them of their mistakes, but about freeing myself from the hold those mistakes had on me. I had found my own path, my own happiness, and that was the greatest gift I could have ever given myself. I had finally stepped out of Eliza's shadow, and the future was mine to shape. Just as I thought my life was finally coming together, the unexpected happened. It was late one evening, and I was curled up on the couch with a book, enjoying the peace and quiet of my small apartment. The phone rang, and I answered it without thinking, expecting it to be a friend or a telemarketer. But the voice on the other end was one I hadn't heard in years. "Lucy?" I froze, my heart skipping a beat. It was Eliza. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. It couldn't be her. She was dead. I had seen her body, attended her cremation, said my goodbyes. This had to be some kind of sick joke. "Eliza?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Yes, it's me," the voice replied, sounding both familiar and foreign at the same time. "I'm sorry for what happened, Lucy. I'm sorry for everything." I was speechless, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. It had to be a hallucination, a figment of my imagination, a result of the years of trauma I had endured. But the voice was so clear, so distinct, that I couldn't shake the feeling that it was really her. "I know you don't believe me," the voice continued, "but I needed to talk to you, to explain. Tears filled my eyes as I struggled to make sense of what was happening. Explain what? You're dead, Eliza. How is this even possible? The voice sighed softly. I know it's hard to understand, but I'm not truly gone. My spirit is still here, lingering in this world, and I can't move on until I make things right with you. I shook my head, trying to banish the voice from my mind. This isn't real. You're not real. Lucy, please listen, the voice pleaded. I know I wasn't a good sister. I know I hurt you in ways I can never take back. But I need you to know that I never meant to. I was just as trapped as you were by our parents, by my illness. I never wanted to be the cause of your pain. I didn't know what to say. The emotions flooding through me were too overwhelming, too conflicting. Was this really Eliza, reaching out to me from beyond the grave? Or was it just my mind playing tricks on me, trying to cope with the unresolved trauma? Why now? I finally managed to ask. Why after all this time? Because I've seen you, Lucy, the voice said, a note of sadness in it. I've seen how hard you've worked to rebuild your life, to find your own path. I'm so proud of you, and I want you to know that. But I also know that there's a part of you that's still hurting, still carrying the weight of our past. I don't want to be the reason you can't move forward. The tears were flowing freely now, and I couldn't hold them back. I've been trying, Eliza. I've been trying so hard to move on. And you're doing so well, the voice said gently. But I needed to tell you that it's okay to let go, to forgive yourself for the choices you made. You were never selfish, Lucy. You did everything you could to help me, and I'm so grateful for that. But it's time for you to be free, to live your life without the burden of guilt. I closed my eyes, letting the words wash over me. Whether or not this was truly Eliza, I realized that this was something I needed to hear, something that could finally help me find the closure I had been searching for. Thank you, I whispered, my voice choked with emotion. Thank you, Eliza. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then the voice said softly, Goodbye, Lucy. I love you. And then the line went dead. I sat there, the phone still pressed to my ear, the weight of what had just happened settling over me. I didn't know if it had been real or not, but in that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was that I felt a sense of peace, a release from the chains that had bound me to the past. Eliza was gone, but her final message had given me the closure I needed. I was free. As I hung up the phone and wiped away my tears, I realized that my life was finally my own. The shadow of the past had lifted and the future stretched out before me, full of possibilities, and I was ready to embrace it. The strange phone call from Eliza, whether real or imagined, had a profound impact on me. It was as if the last vestiges of the past had finally been put to rest, and with that, a new chapter of my life began. I threw myself into my studies, determined to make the most of the opportunities I had been given. I explored new hobbies, made new friends, and slowly but surely built a life that was truly my own. For the first time, I felt a sense of purpose that wasn't tied to someone else's needs or expectations. I was living for myself, and it was exhilarating. My relationship with my parents remained distant, but over time, there were small signs of reconciliation. They never fully understood the depth of my pain or the reasons behind my outburst at the cremation. But there were moments when I saw glimpses of regret in their eyes, moments when they seemed to realize that they had failed me in ways they could never fully atone for. But I no longer needed their validation. I had found my own strength, my own identity, and that was enough. Years passed, and I continued to grow and evolve. I graduated from college with honors, pursued a career in social work, and dedicated my life to helping others who had been through similar experiences. I found fulfillment in my work, knowing that I was making a difference in the lives of those who needed it most. But despite all the progress I had made, there were still moments when the past would creep back in. Moments when I would find myself thinking about Eliza, about the life we had shared, and about the final phone call that had brought me so much peace. One day, while sorting through some old boxes, I came across a photograph of Eliza and me as children. We were sitting on a swing set in the park, both of us smiling, our faces filled with the innocence of youth. It was a rare moment of happiness, a snapshot of a time before the weight of our family's dysfunction had fully settled on our shoulders. As I stared at the photograph, I felt a mix of emotions: sadness, nostalgia, and a deep sense of love for the sister I had lost. Despite everything, despite the pain and resentment, there had been love between us. It had been buried beneath layers of duty and obligation, but it had always been there, a bond that no amount of hardship could fully erase. I placed the photograph on my desk, a reminder of where I had come from and how far I had come. It was a symbol of the journey I had taken, a journey of self-discovery, healing, and ultimately forgiveness. And as I looked at that photograph, I knew that I had finally made peace with the past. I had found my own path, my own happiness, and I was ready to continue moving forward, embracing whatever the future held. Because for the first time in my life, I was living for myself, and that was the greatest gift of all.